Ready at Dawn, the studio behind Lone Echo, Lone Echo 2, Echo VR, and Echo Combat, has been shut down by Meta effective immediately. This is obviously terrible news, but how do we get here, and what does this mean for the other 8 studios operating under Meta? It's a live open daily podcast. Let's talk about it. I'm your host, Live Open Mike. I had to take the last 7 days off to deal with some personal matters, and I was hoping I would come back with a bit more of a positive story. You'll probably get that one tomorrow. But then this news broke and I had to talk about it. The first report of this came from Nicholas Subrich over at Android Central. I'm not going to read the whole article. I will leave a link down in the show notes if you want to read it for yourself. Just going to hit one little bit that I wanted to point out here. Meta first made cuts to the studio last February when it announced it would shutter Echo VR despite still having a player count, quote, in the low 10,000s, as noted by Meta CTO Andrew Bosworth at the time. It's worth noting that Meta just stated that Quest 3 sales are exceeding their expectations in the company's most recent quarterly earnings call last week. One report in mid-July said that Meta was cutting its Reality Labs division budget by 20% by 2026, and Meta's official blog post supports this reasoning. A Meta spokesperson told Android Central that the cuts weren't being made to save money per se, rather these cuts are being made to ensure that Reality Labs stays within the new budgetary constraints and that Oculus Studios can make a better long-term impact in VR development. Again, I'll leave a link to the full article from Nick Subrich in the show notes. So first things first, this sucks, and my thoughts are out to the people who are affected by this, and we hope that you all land on your feet soon. It has been reported that the Ready at Dawn employees that were affected by these layoffs can actually apply for other jobs within Oculus Studios if they so choose to do so, so maybe that cushions the blow a little bit, but frankly, if you got told by your boss, hey, you don't have a job anymore effective today, good luck. How are you going to feel about that? It's just a terrible situation. The gaming industry in general, not just in VR, has gone through a really tough time. In the last 2 years, there's been tens of thousands of layoffs. There have already been more layoffs this year in 2024 than in all of 2023 combined, and we're barely into August as I record this podcast. It's really scary. Just to go through a quick list here, London Studio, that was the company behind Blood and Truth and the original PlayStation VR 1. Sony also laid off people from Firesprite, that's the company that made Horizon Call of the Mountain. We've seen Wemo Games, the ones who made Micro Machines and Battle Bow, shut down. First Contact Entertainment, who made Firewall Zero Hour and Firewall Ultra for PlayStation's VR 1 and 2 respectively. They shut down shortly after Firewall Ultra launched. RKX Studios, who made Freediver, Triton Down, and Journey to the Foundation, they recently just went through layoffs. Digital Load, makers of the Espire games, they went through layoffs last year, and I could go on and on and on. There's just been a ton of these. And then within Meta's own four walls, Ready at Dawn had just gone through a series of layoffs last year, as did Downpour Interactive, the people who made Onward. Now, some of those people from Downpour Interactive went off to make another studio, and they're making another milsim called Tier 1. I'll have a video up about that one here pretty soon. But back to Ready at Dawn, I'm already seeing some people saying, well, they shouldn't have shut down Echo VR, or otherwise the studio will still be open. And those people are kind of missing the boat here. Now, a lot of people got upset when it was announced that Echo VR had a player count in the low 10,000s or so. So let's say that's 12,000 people. That's a pretty good number for a VR game, and frankly, a lot of development studios would just do backflips if they had that many players in their game on a monthly basis, because you'll see some games that have player counts as low as like the double digits, like less than 100 players a month, and it's just really bad for multiplayer games. Because you'll see some multiplayer games that have player counts in like the double digits. We're talking like less than 100 players a month, and those games quickly end up going away because that's not a tenable number. But let's just say, because it's in the low 10,000s, let's just say that number is 12,000. If you are a free-to-play game and you need to make, let's just say, $1 million in revenue, which I think is a very, very low number given the size of Ready at Dawn's team, but let's just say you had to make $1 million in revenue to justify keeping your studio open and actually be profitable, that would mean that your 12,000 player count would need to spend an average of about $84 over the course of a year on your free-to-play game to keep the game going. So as you're listening to this podcast, think about all the free-to-play games that you own right now and that you play on a regular basis, and ask yourself if you're spending an average of $84 a year on each one of them. The answer I'm going to say is no. So because your player count is in the low 10,000s, you're relying on, number one, either a higher percentage of those players to be spending a lot of money, or two, a lower percentage of players to be spending a fair amount of money. Contrast that with something like Gorilla Tag. That game's been out for 3 years and has made reportedly about $26 million in the 3 years since it's been released. But that game also averages millions of players every single month. It's somewhere around like 2.5 to 3 million players every month. So the number of people that you need to be actively spending money on the app and microtransactions and in-game currency and things like that is much lower percentage wise than if you have a player count in like the low 10,000s. At that number, you need almost every single player to be spending money every single month. Now, Echo VR did have a seasonal pass called the Echo Pass, and this was something that I think Resolution Games ran into with Ultimax as well. There was a free path and there was a premium path on that for all the cosmetics. The free path was open to every single person that ever played the game, and the premium one worked out to, if you do the math on how much their in-game currency costs, it worked out to about $10 a month. How many of those players, if you already have the free path that you can earn cosmetics from, are going to spend the $10 to upgrade to the premium pass? You need some really good cosmetics to do that. The long and short of what I'm trying to say is take the community aspect away from it, take like the emotional aspect away from it, and just look at it as a business. Echo VR wasn't profitable, not at the scale that Meta needed to be. That's why it went away. That doesn't mean I'm defending that decision, because frankly I thought the decision was a terrible PR move for Meta, and they're still kind of recovering from that. This isn't going to do them any favors either, but I understand it from a business perspective and what Meta's actually trying to do at scale. The thing that really concerned me is looking at the other 8 studios Meta owns, because not all those studios have an active property out right now that they can actually be updating, and that pretty much will maybe keep them safe. Even in some instances that wouldn't keep them safe. We'll go through a couple of examples of that in a minute. But let's just run through Meta's now 8 remaining studios. There's Beat Games, who makes Beat Saber. I think they're perfectly fine. Beat Saber is a cash cow for Meta. That game makes millions of dollars. No issues there. There's Within, who has Supernatural. Supernatural has a subscription service that apparently does very well for them. It's considered one of the top workout apps in VR, little known on Quest alone. They're going to be fine. I'm not worried about them. Then there's Big Box, who made Population 1. That game is now free to play if you are on Quest alone. If you're on standalone, if you want to play the game on PC VR, you still have to pay for it. But that is another game that is baked full of microtransactions, and the game is doing well enough that Meta probably felt okay saying, hey, you know what? We'll take it free to play because we're making our money back in microtransactions. I think Big Box is fine. Those are the only 3, honestly, that I think are 100% safe. Let's go through the other ones. You got Camouflage, who released Batman Arkham Shadows, and they've done a round of really heavy marketing, developers out there doing interviews. I think there's a lot of pressure on Batman Arkham Shadows to do well, because if that game doesn't sell, assuming Meta doesn't like bundle it with the Meta Quest 3S, which honestly is what I think they should do, if that game doesn't sell well enough to justify keeping that studio open, and that game, unlike Asgard's Wrath 2, which we'll talk about in a minute, doesn't have like a roguelite mode that can get consistent updates and keep players coming back to the game, frankly, I'm pretty worried about Camouflage. Even if Batman Arkham Shadows does well, that doesn't guarantee success. Sony laid off a bunch of people from Insomniac Games who used to make VR games, and now they make Marvel games. One of the biggest games of last year was Spider-Man 2 that was made by Insomniac Games. That game has sold over 11 million copies. It has made almost $1 billion in revenue, and Sony still laid off some of that team because the game wasn't profitable enough. Part of that was the budget of the game, but I digress. Having a successful game doesn't necessarily make you immune from layoffs and things like that. We just saw VR Chat go through a bunch of layoffs. I did a previous pod about that one. Go and check that out. Bungie, the makers of Destiny 2, just went through layoffs. Tango Gameworks, who made Hi-Fi Rush, a very successful game, but all accounts was just shut down by Microsoft. There's countless examples of studios releasing good games, critically acclaimed games, but they're not making enough to justify the expenditure going into them, especially since a lot of these bigger companies like Microsoft, like the Embracer Group, like Sony, like Meta, are buying new studios for some pretty high dollar amounts. EA is another example of that. Now they have to balance their books to justify the cost of buying these massive companies, and when you do that, sometimes success doesn't necessarily guarantee being safe. So going back to Meta Studios to continue down the list, we're through 4 of them now. So the other ones are, let's see, Downpour Interactive, we just talked about them. They went through layoffs last year. They do still have Onward out, and there was a rumor Mark Zuckerberg mentioned at some point that he was excited about Onward 2, but that was before that studio went through a whole bunch of layoffs and is now basically a skeleton crew of what it once was. But Downpour Interactive is still doing active updates on Onward, but we don't know what the player count for that game looks like. If Echo VR got shut down with a player count in the low tens of thousands, we don't know what Downpour Interactive looks like. That's a scary thought. Then there's Armature Studio. They did the port of Resident Evil 4 on Quest, but that game came out in October of 2021, so almost 3 years ago. They haven't put out a single game since. They don't have any job listings out there. We don't know what they're working on. I'm really worried about Armature. And lastly, there's Twisted Pixel, makers of a couple of my favorite games, Path of the Warrior, Defector. We won't talk about the B team, but they've made some pretty good games out there. They were bought out by Meta a while back and actually do have a job listing up. They're hiring a game director for what they call a AAA game. But again, we've seen studios shut down when they were working on projects before. Matter of fact, a lot of studios that get shut down are usually working on big projects, or at least new projects when that happens. It's not like they're sitting around twiddling their thumbs saying, hey, yeah, you know what, we're not really doing any updates, we're not doing any new games, we're good, we're just gonna sit back and collect our paycheck. No, the reality is when all these studios get closed, they're usually working on something new. So even with Twisted Pixel having another project coming out, that doesn't necessarily guarantee safety Or worse yet, what if that game comes out and then they decide afterwards, okay, the game's out now and we don't need all these other developers, we just need a team to like fix all the bugs, maybe we can let go of some of these people. That's what happened to Digital Load after the mixed reality mode for Espire 2 came out. I think it was like 2 or 3 weeks after MR missions dropped. Digital Load say they were going through layoffs again. So coming back to this article from Android Central, it's quoted that Meta saying the reduction was made to meet the new Reality Labs budgetary ceiling rather than as a proactive cost-cutting initiative. So just being real, unless Ready at Dawn had enough people to equal 20% of Reality Labs' huge budget, chances are more layoffs are coming. Now all those are going to be in gaming. There's probably going to be some people on like the AR side or the AI side who get laid off too. I really don't think we've seen the last of this because Ready at Dawn was not a big enough team to equal 20%. So again, I'm worried about Twisted Pixel. I'm worried about Armature. I'm worried about people in like the AR glasses division, the AI division. This is still a business, and as much as we gamers would like to think that it's about the art form and the creativity, sadly it's not. And there's more of these big companies about these smaller studios, and now they have investors and shareholders that they're accountable to. More of this is going to happen. Moreover, and I think this is something that I think about a lot in terms of like the future of VR, there are now more gamers than really ever have been in any other generation of gaming. There are literally hundreds of millions of people playing games, but they're playing less games. There are games out there like Minecraft and Roblox and Fortnite. In VR, there are games like Gorilla Tag and Population 1 and Contractor Showdown and Ghost of Tabor and Breachers and a bunch of other online games that I can name, where people are just playing those games and almost only those games, and they're not branching out and buying new titles. Frankly, I think it was a shrewd move for Meta to make Asgard's Wrath 2 free with the Quest 3, because how many people got into that game, and even if they didn't play the full story, I saw an achievement award listed on Reddit the other day that less than 10,000 people have actually finished the full story of Asgard's Wrath 2. But because of the roguelite mode built into that game, and you have a short gameplay loop that people can pop in, do a run, and get back out, that game has probably maintained the active player base, and I think Sanzaru knows that, which is why they're doing a monthly update for that game every single month, introducing new content and new cosmetics and new skins to earn, because they have to keep the player count up. For as many gamers that there are out there in the world right now, they're buying less games and they're playing less games because a lot of these bigger games are expanding to include more stuff. Fortnite just did this massive expansion recently where now instead of just being the plain old shooter, now there's a rhythm game installed in that, and there's a battle pass associated with that as well. There's a Rocket League ripoff in that. There are more reasons to play Fortnite now other than just shooting people, and people are going to gravitate more towards that because now there's more variety in that game, as opposed to say, hey, I'm going to pick up this new game that just released. And that's a scary thought when you look at like, let's say like the top downloads on each of these platforms. When you look at the top sellers on Meta Quest, when you look at the top downloads every single month on Sony for PSVR 2, you're going to see a lot of the same suspects over and over and over again. You're going to see the job simulators and Beat Sabers of the world in the top 10 selling games or downloads if you look at the Sony's list every single month. Pavlov is another one that's always perennially in the top 10 downloads or sales depending on which platform you're on. And you very rarely see a new game crack that top 10. Now, a couple of months ago, there were a bunch of developers doing like 90% discounts on Quest, and I know like Max Muster was the #1 game on the Quest store for a while, but that lasted maybe 2 weeks. Zombieland Headshot Fever also did 90% off. They were up there for a while. Death Horizon Reloaded also did the same thing. They were up there for a while. But generally, you're going to see the same probably 5 or 6 games in the top 10 pretty often. And if you see a new game come in there, generally it's from like the 11 to 15 range, and then it might slide to the top 10 and it'll slide right back out. If you look at Sony's top 10 downloads every month for PSVR 2, generally if there's a new game that came out that month, that game might make the top 10 that month, but then it slides right back out and you're back to the usual suspects. On PlayStation VR 2, that's usually like Beat Saber, there's Pavlov, there's Creed. Creed's always up there. The Shop Simulator, it's all the same suspects over and over and over again. People are coming back to those games repeatedly as opposed to trying new games, and that's a scary thought for the industry as a whole. Not just VR, but the whole gaming industry. If you have more players playing less games, how are you putting out the new title supposed to make a dent? And then there's the storefront part of it. Now, Echo VR is already delisted. You can't download that game anymore. But what about Lone Echo and Lone Echo 2 on Meta's pretty much ignored PC VR store? If no one's around to keep those games in compliance, the next time that there's a major SDK update or anything like that, what happens to those games when they fall out of compliance with the latest SDKs, like pretty much every Oculus Go game at this point? Now, I don't own Lone Echo 2, but I'm probably going to go ahead and buy it this weekend and just download it so I have it on my system, just so it doesn't fall to the wayside, like my fear was when Insomniac Games got bought out by Sony. I went ahead and downloaded Stormland and Feral Rights and Edge of Nowhere to my system, just in case they fell out of compliance and I was no longer able to download those games anymore. So those games are living on my system permanently in case I ever want to play them. Now, I get the Meta's trying to put Reality Labs on the path of profitability and all that stuff, yada yada yada. Just speaking as a gamer, it still sucks. Now, one of the studios behind some of VR's best games, Lone Echo 1 is being held up as one of the best VR games ever made, certainly one of the best PC VR video games ever made. Now that studio's gone and there's nothing to show for it, and it's awful. That's a wrap for this episode. Thank you for checking it out. Wish I could have came back from my little hiatus with a bit of better news, but hopefully we get some more upbeat news moving forward. Check out Live Open Daily on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and iHeart. Also check me out on Twitch. I stream VR there a few days a week. Twitch.tv/liveopenmic. Thanks, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.